Welcome to the start of our journey into the interesting but often complex world of syntax. In this lesson, we are going to learn how participles function in context because, as Dr. Dan Wallace rightly notes, the context has more influence on participles than on any other area of Greek grammar. Unless otherwise noted, much of the ideas, examples, and information in this presentation in some form were drawn from the insights and various scholarly works of Drs. Bill Mounds, Dan Wallace, Christopher Plummer, A.T. Robertson, and Kevin Smith. We begin our journey with a verse out of the Greek New Testament itself. Mark 1 verse 4 reads, Egeneto Johannes ho baptizon en te eremo, ke kairuson baptisma metanoias is aphesin hamartion. Translation: John the Baptizer, or John the one baptizing, it is he who appeared in the wilderness, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. An important exegetical clue that I don't want you to miss is that the article ha of habaptizon is in square brackets. This is so because a question is asked concerning its originality, in other words, whether it was in the original Greek text or not. For the purpose of learning, we are going to look at both options. In other words, starting with the articular habaptizon, we are going to determine how these participles function in this given context and sentence. We begin with our main clause, which is Egeneto Johannes, John came, or John appeared on the scene. The essence of meaning described by the verb ginemai, according to BDAG, is that John was there at a given time in the wilderness. The main clause is then developed by two participle phrases, the first one being habaptizon en te eremo. Translation: John the Baptizer, or John the one baptizing in the wilderness, it is he who came or appeared on the scene, or who was in the wilderness. Although the verbal aspect in an adjectival or substantival participle is not entirely diminished, it is apparent in this context that habaptizon here is primarily modifying the noun Johannes. So we already have a very strong clue that this might be an adjectival participle and not an adverbial participle. There are two key identifiers or key clues that tells us what type of participle we are dealing with. The first one, of course, is the presence of the article. Whenever you see a participle with an article, you can know for sure that that must be an adjectival participle. It cannot be adverbial. It can either be an adjectival proper or it can be a substantival participle, but it cannot be adverbial. And then the second clue, of course, is context. In this context, it is very apparent that habaptizon here is not primarily modifying the main verb egeneto, or that the action described by habaptizon is not primarily directed towards the main verb egeneto, but it is, as we have said, modifying the noun Johannes. So we already know this must be an adjectival participle. It cannot be adverbial. But let's now move on to the second participle phrase, which is kairuson baptisma metanoias is aphesin hamartion. Translation: John appeared on the scene, or John was on the scene, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. I hope you have noticed that the action described by keruson, unlike the one described by habaptizon, is mainly directed towards the main verb egenetor. Or differently put, keruson in this sentence and context is telling us more about the action of the main verb. We therefore know that this must be an adverbial and not an adjectival participle. Just a word of caution though. Remember I told you that the presence of the article is a sure clue that we are dealing with an adjectival participle. The same cannot be said for an anatherous participle, because an anatherous participle can either be adjectival or it can be adverbial. Our main indicator of how that participle functions in that given context is context. In this context, it is very clear that keruson is functioning as an adverbial and not an adjectival participle. For the purpose of learning, I want us now to look at the alternative rendering, where the participle baptizon, like keruson, is anatherous. And I want us then to look how it will function in this context and sentence, and specifically whether there are changes concerning its function. We again begin with the main clause, which is egenetor Johannes, John came. The main verb is then developed by two anatherous participle phrases. Baptizon ente remo and keruson baptisma metanoias is aphesin hamartion. Translation: John came, baptizing in the wilderness and preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. You can immediately recognize that the form of baptizon didn't change. But what you also most probably already have noticed is that its function has now changed. Instead of it being an adjectival participle, together with keruson, the actions described by baptizon and keruson are mainly directed towards the main verb egenetor. In other words, we can know for sure that both of them must be adverbial participles. An important part of learning would be to look at the exegetical difficulties that we have in this text. We have already determined that both these participles, baptizon and keruson, are functioning as adverbial participles, since the actions described by both of them are mainly directed towards the main verb egenetor. That is the easy part. What becomes more difficult, though, is to know in which of the 8 categories that adverbial participles can fall into these two fit. One of the most widely accepted views seems to be that these two are adverbial participles of manner. In other words, that it answers the question of how John came. If so, then it will tell us that John came by means of baptizing and preaching. Not all scholars seem to agree with that, though. Kevin's intuition is that almost all of these post-verbal present tense participles that we have here, that don't clearly fit into one of the more precise categories in Wallace, should be classified as temporal. A temporal participle, of course, will answer the question when John came. So the present participle is normally contemporaneous in time to the action of the main verb. In other words, the actions of baptizing and preaching describe coordinate actions that John performed when he came. To cut out all confusion, let us now compare the two side by side. We start with the articular habaptizon, which, as we have seen, is functioning as an adjectival participle, since it is mainly modifying the noun Johannes. In translation, we would bring it out as John the Baptizer. Kairouson, the participle kairouson, we have seen that the function of kairouson stays the same in both instances, in both renderings. Just to reiterate, or just to recap, it is functioning as an adverbial participle in both instances, since the action described by the participle is mainly directed towards the verb egenitor, or differently put, it gives us more information about the action of the main verb egenitor, which is nicely brought out in translation. I'm going to read the entire sentence. John the Baptizer appeared in the wilderness preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. Now let us look at its anatherous counterpart, which we have seen is like kairouson, functioning in an adverbial capacity. Both of these are adverbial participles, since the actions described by both of them are mainly directed towards the main verb egenitor. Remember, we said that it's not the fact that it is anatherous participles, but the context that tells us that both these participles are functioning as adverbial participles, which is nicely brought out in translation, because we can clearly see the link between John appeared and the actions of both baptizing and preaching. John appeared, baptizing in the wilderness and preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. In summary, the main points. Firstly, remember that as a verbal adjective, a participle has the characteristic of both verbs and adjectives. Secondly, that as a verb, it has tense and it has voice. Thirdly, as an adjective, it agrees with the word it modifies in case, number, and gender. Fourth, there is no difference in form between the adverbial and an adjectival participle. So how do we know? We have learned that there are two distinguishing clues. The first one is the article. Remember, we have said that as whenever you see an article with a participle, you know for sure that that must be an adjectival participle. It cannot be adverbial. It can either be an adjectival proper or it can be substantival, but it cannot be adverbial. And then the second clue is context.